Good morning, everybody. And for those of you in Europe that are joining us, good evening. I thank you for staying up late. Our presentation for this webinar is timed for about 15 to 20 minutes. To respect your time, we intend on taking questions and answering them throughout the presentation. You can submit a question to us by clicking on the Ask a Question link at the bottom of the screen. To give you a little information about what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to be introducing a simple framework for attracting and screening prospective board members, which is also suitable for other associations such as your parent associations. This will include demonstrating an online diagnostic tool, which Paul will give us more details about towards the end of the webinar, something that he and I have been collaborating on, not only to help you identify prospective governors and parent association members, but to build engagement with your community. So we hope you find value in that. At the end of the webinar, we'd also want to explain how this ties into our next topic we're going to be talking about in Hong Kong on September 22nd, which is about selecting and orientating our governors to prepare them for their role. So with that said, that is our agenda. And what I'd like to do now is do a brief personal introduction to Paul and I. So Paul, if you don't mind, can you tell us a little about yourself?
Thanks, Michael. Yes, hi, my name's Paul Smith. I'm the founder and CEO of the Future Directors Institute. I am obsessed with the potential of human individuals and groups. And for a number of years, I've been working with directors and boards to help enhance that potential. So we do sort of career management at the director level, whether you're aspiring or merging or an experienced director. And at the board level, we consult to boards around composition, about recruitment, and it's all about enhancing the outcomes at that board level. We do that in Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong now with Michael, and we've been doing some work with some school boards in America as well. So we're starting to see a lot more demand for this sort of potential side of things from the boardroom. On a personal level, I'm a father of one boy who started primary school recently. So the school side of things is certainly of a now even more personal interest to me as well.
Great. For myself, firstly, I'll begin where Paul ended. I'm a father of two and based here in Hong Kong. My wife is a teacher at an international school here, as well as a head of department. I am a Council of International Schools affiliated consultant, which means I generally work with schools before or after an accreditation process. I'm there to help support them in terms of understanding their own growth potential. I began my career in education 19 years ago, where I was a developmental psychologist and specialist working with special needs children. In this journey, I found myself in China, which is actually 19 years ago today. And since that time, I've been working in both the private and public sectors, education, as well as in other industries. Where I've taken on a number of different types of assignments, most of which what we're going to be talking about today relates to governance. I've had my foot in both pools. I've had it in the education pool, and I've had it in the corporate pool. And one of the strengths I really bring not only to the boards, but to school leadership when I consult with them, is I help to translate how those organizations are the same and bring best practice to them. And I hope today's talk will also shine light on those practices, contextualized for an educational setting. With that said, I think what we'd like to do is move to our first slide and get this ball rolling. So, problems inherent in many school boards. Well, to address this question, we really first need to understand what type of school board are we talking about. Many consultants and professionals out there try to distill it down to a set of 3 or 5, potentially 12. But to be honest with you, a school board is much like a fingerprint. Every school board is different. So when you're recruiting for a school board, you really need to take into account so many different cues. You have national and municipal ordinances. You have the way boards are formed based on their articles of incorporation, their M&As. You have the communities that they're serving. You could be part of a larger group of 24 or 30 schools, but ultimately the community, the municipal ordinances, and those guiding principles determine how you can structure a board, everything from term limits to participation. You have on large scale, what you'll see is you'll have parent elected, appointed, and self-perpetuating boards, not-for-profit, and for-profit. Within those boards, though, one of the things we have to worry about is in terms of the nomination process. Some are very tightly managed and not very transparent, and some are an open door. So common problems I see, say, with a parent elected board would be that open door approach. And even though it's an open door approach, it's still not very transparent. So recruiting board members can be very difficult in the sense that they don't really know what the job entails. They see it as more of a goodwill gesture, and they're very appreciative of other people that step up to do it, but they don't quite realize the true importance of that role. Whereas when you have it in a more self-perpetuating board, to have a nominations committee is quite normal. And within that nominations committee, often it's through personal networks that governors are being recruited. And through our personal networks, sometimes there's a greater distance between that individual and the school, which isn't necessarily bad, but if too many of our governors are distanced from the school community, that does create issues long-term. So that's effectively what I'm seeing in terms of schools on a spectrum of issues in terms of recruitment. Let's see. Have we got any questions out there?
Yeah, we've got a question here coming in here. What's the largest obstacle for parents for parent-elected boards when recruiting governors?
All right, yeah. So I'm looking at that one, and if I were to interpret that, you know, interestingly enough, I'm working with a couple of schools right now that are parent-elected boards, and for them, it's often the same case. It's always the same people stepping up. And here's a particular example in Asia that might be hitting close to home for a few of you that I see are registered today. They see a lot more participation from their expat parents than they do from their local parents, the Asian parents. When we look at this and we try to find ways to create better representation on the board of the whole community, what we're looking for is trying to make the work of the board much more transparent by getting the board more ingrained in the community and getting them to show and exemplify, demonstrate what their work leads to. Specifically, one of the most important things to consider is that the average tenure for a head of school or a principal that's leading a school is about 3 or less than 3 years, from what I'm looking at anecdotally across all the schools I work with and within the Acamus organization. So with that said, your board is your stopgap to ensuring that your children's welfare is going to be taken well looked after. So to address that parent-elected issue, I would really recommend you need to create greater transparency in terms of defining what the role is, really create a sense of ownership in terms of parents within that board, and recruit more heavily that greater representation across the community.
I think that's a good place for us to move on to our next slide, which is more about the potential.
All right. So Paul, would you like to take that on?
Yeah, so essentially, if we're talking about what is the potential for school board recruitment, as Mike said, that you know, the school board plays such a vital, important role given the shorter tenure of the head of school, and you know they really are setting up the long-term viability. So it just tells you how important it is to make sure that you have the best mix of candidates. And what I'd like to go through now is just some of the points about what your board would need potentially. So very, very simply, essentially, there's 4 key points. First of all, you want to make sure that your board has the right mix of skills, experience, perspectives, mindsets, you know, that sort of diversity angle. And again, it's very easy to identify diversity from a physical standpoint in terms of gender, age, background, but it's more important to have that different cognitive diversity. And that comes from people's technical abilities, their experiences and their perspectives and the way they look at the world. And to get the best out of a group like that, you have to ensure that you have strong leadership and a great culture of inclusiveness. But before that as well, you need to make sure that you have people who are really committed to this group. Michael's pointed towards this already in terms of, needing them to be investing for a medium term at least, preferably for a longer term. And we're talking 5 to 6 year period here is a good standard. So you're really looking for people who are going into this with their eyes wide open. That's the sort of commitment, but making sure that you also have the refreshment going on within that group and that stage. So you're not having everybody walk out the door at the same time. You have a good stage level of new voices, new perspectives, different skills coming in, and you have a particular skills leaving. Make sure they're being replaced if you think they are actually important. We'll get onto that later. The next thing is to make sure you have a very clear recruitment and onboarding policies and procedures in terms of different stages of that process. Where are you going to look? When you actually are shortlisting people, who's interviewing them? And we're going to touch on some of the things you can do later on. But ultimately, you want to know exactly what you are looking for and have a candidate engagement process that attracts a much wider and more qualified group of potential board members. And that's sort of where we're going to really get onto now.
All right. Paul, I'm seeing a question here that somebody's asking about alumni. What's the potential for alumni? If you don't mind, I'll just address that really quickly as well.
Sure.
The potential for alumni, to be honest with you, it's one of the things I most highly recommend is that schools tap into alumni to bring them back. Alumni provide you a variety of benefits. The greatest benefit that when you think about the longevity and sustainability of an organizational mission and its values is that the alumni are derived from those principles, those values and beliefs that were originally instilled in the school. And where I see schools getting lost here in the last 5 to 10 years, especially in a hyper-competitive environment in Asia, is that they really start to move further away from those values and they start chasing the demographic to really put seats in, to get more students into the school. Whereas alumni hopefully provide that sort of grounding to say, hey, look, this is what worked, this is who we were, and this is who we need to continue to be. So really quickly about alumni, they're a great grounding factor, and I think you should be recruiting more of them. That said, moving into slide 3, what is the best practice for school board recruitment? Paul, can you share with us some of your examples from in and outside the education world?
Yeah, and that's the thing. We help. We don't just looking at helping schools. The recruitment process, best practice for recruitment is across the board. Whether you're a school, a large corporation, publicly listed company, or another sort of community or non-profit, whatever it happens to be, a startup, you really want to have, it's a similar process. The best practice is a similar process. And this is something we've learned through our experience working with lots of different types of boards. So the first step is to really get clear on what you need. Now, you want to be prepared as possible for the recruitment period. And, if you are sort of starting at this point and investing quite a bit of time into this, you want to conduct what we would call as a gap and needs analysis of your board. So that you have a simple process for this where we work with boards whereby we look at their medium to long-term strategic objectives and what skills and experience they'll need on the board to maximize their chances of actually achieving those objectives. And what are their overall needs? So basically, what have they already got on their board? Who have they already got on their board, and what are the gaps they need to fill? That's a very simple way of actually thinking about your recruitment going forward. Now, this forms the basis of any sort of role description, but what stands us apart and what we like to do with boards, and I think what stands other boards apart more, is it's not just the technical skills in terms of the gaps you might have. For example, you might want people who are experts in fundraising or community engagement, or they have particular governance or legal or financial skills. Those are the technical skills. But what we like to always also focus on is also what we call the human skills, or what you might be known as soft skills. You know, what values are important to you as a group? So whilst we look at diversity, you don't have to have diversity of values. Values like open-mindedness, emotional intelligence, you know, communications in terms of wanting to have open dialogue. These are fantastic human skills, and it actually helps get the best out of the group. So these are sort of examples which are far more valuable to you than potentially dogma or bias. So the first thing is really get clear on what you need, and that will drive the rest of your recruitment process. The next step is to cast in the wider net, and Michael's already talked about the alumni, thanks to that fantastic question that came through. And it really is about looking beyond your existing networks, or looking deeper into the networks that already exists. Before we move forward, Michael, I'd really like to ask you, you know, you've obviously observed this quite a bit. What have you seen in terms of schools casting out a net for when they're recruiting governors?
All right. I'll give you an interesting sort of anecdote. Think about an organization's annual general meeting, the AGM. Schools have them as well. And a lot of schools find that their AGMs are fairly underrepresented because quite a few people don't feel like they can have a voice in the matter. Unless there is some really specific traumatic event that has happened recently. And I won't give examples of those, but for all of those of you that are listening, you know what they are that drive people into the school. And unfortunately, those are the types of events that we don't want to be trying to recruit people because they're possibly joining for the wrong reason. But when we take a look at casting that net wider, how do you create that same sort of opportunity where you're bringing a lot of people into the school and then taking advantage of the fact that they're there? Well, think of your annual fairs that you do, any sort of parent night evenings. Every opportunity to educate your community on what the board does and what the school needs in terms of its governorship is an opportunity to cast that net wider. Not just alumni as well, but let's look at people that used to have kids on the board. For consular community schools that were maybe sponsored by either governments or companies, often the articles mandate that they need to have a representative on that board. Well, they don't necessarily need to be a parent. Let's look a little bit further afoot and see that we're finding somebody that represents what those original values were that brought that company to sponsoring the school. So in terms of casting that net, those are just a few ideas that I'd like to share with you now. Paul?
Yeah, and again, I think it's really moving beyond that sort of simple sending out an announcement and getting a low response, or, you know, walking up to people that you know and tapping them on the shoulder and wanting them to sort of come straight there, as you sort of mentioned beforehand. You know, there's so much more that you can do to promote this to a wider audience within the community. You know, social media is a perfect place for that, where the community is there, ready and able. But how do you actually overcome a problem of low engagement with potential candidates and ensure that you have a larger pool? And that's what takes us to our next step in this process. And that's to add a filter for you and your candidates. Many good candidates in our experience don't actually apply for a board role because of low confidence in themselves. They may have all the requisite skills, but they're not actually sure if this is for them or not. And they're not sure if they really want to put the time and effort into putting in, you know, the application. On the same side, potentially poorer candidates, you know, with not the requisite skills, maybe a little bit overconfident and do apply. So you end up with this situation where you don't get the right candidates, and we're very much clear about this being the right candidate. So how do you create this sort of low touch filter for candidates for both candidates to self-diagnose their ability and their desire to apply for the role before they actually go through that process, but also help the school, your school, filter in and out the best possible candidates? And that's essentially what we've developed. You know, Michael talked about earlier the diagnostic tool. We've actually developed a simple yet highly valuable diagnostic tool, which will essentially do that, and we'll introduce that slightly later on.
Paul,
yes, sorry,
an interesting question came up, and I think it's a good way to also premise the tool is that, and if I'm interpreting the question right, it really stems from the fact that, hey, we're volunteers. We're not getting paid for this.
Yeah.
We have regular full-time day jobs and families. You're talking about or leading us into a process of recruitment that needs to be managed. So, what's the obstacle, what would be the main obstacle in implementing this type of filtering process? And can you share an example of what it looks like?
Well, I think that is the main obstacle. It's time and resources. 90% of boards in the world are volunteer-led, and they don't have the money or often the time beyond the time they already commit for free to get involved in this. But I think one of the things I would talk about is there's two things. One is time spent up front here doing this process properly will actually help you further down the line, because one of the things about casting a much wider net is you'll have a whole bunch of candidates that you might not need right now, but will be pre-qualified for later on when you do need new people. So putting a bit of investment here. But one of the biggest bits of advice that we both think is to have a standing subcommittee, nomination subcommittee is a usual term, that includes a whole bunch of different people. And I might ask Michael to get into his advice on who would be on this nominations committee, but essentially they're a standing committee that literally looks after this. So not the entire board, not just the chair of the board, but a subgroup of people across not just the governors, but also people within the school as well. And Michael, if you could go into a bit more detail about who potentially should be on that nominations committee.
So when we look about membership, we go beyond who's on the board and we look at ex officio members. Now, an ex officio member is a very powerful member within the school community. It doesn't necessarily need to be a parent. However, depending on the way your school is structured, and if you're a very community-centric school, then you probably do want some type of parent association ex officio member on that board who can contribute, because that person becomes an advocate. They go out into the community and they engage. Think about your communications and marketing directors at your school who can be ex officio members, because based on the profile of the candidate that we're looking for, they have the strength, the tools, and the experience and the time to go out there and broadcast that message consistently, so that we can be really driving candidates towards us. And let's be honest, for those of you that are not in the education world and are quite familiar with human resource management, and for those within the education world and that are constantly recruiting people, having a pipeline of candidates is incredibly important. How you manage that pipeline as well can bring a great wealth of benefits to you, from trying to get them involved in additional activities while they're waiting in the wings to be a governor, fundraising potential, you name it. So managing a pipeline of candidates can be incredibly important. And if you as a board cannot manage it, bring in ex officio members that have the skills, resources, and tools to do so. Hey, this might actually be a good opportunity to talk about the diagnostic tool. What I'd like to actually really talk about in terms of this diagnostic tool is the fact that your marketing and communications teams can use it. They can embed it into the website. It can be a constant presence that can, where we can be constantly reaching out into our community, and people can be applying to participate more, not only in the board, but in the other activities that we're doing. What Paul's pulling up on the screen now is really kind of a generic version of it, but here it is embedded in the future directors website. So Paul, with that said, can you please tell us more about it?
Yes, I will. And I will. I'm just conscious of the time, because we're sort of running a bit late, but there's so much to talk about there. We'll try and wrap up in just a few minutes, but just going to quickly just take you through this tool that we've developed to help, as I said, both candidates to engage with the recruitment process in an easy, quick, and low-touch way. This tool takes less than 5 minutes to complete, but also helps the school deepen and widen the pool of candidates. Because essentially you've got a sort of almost like a marketing tool for people to use instead of just here's an application form and put in your CV, here's a 5-minute tool for you to use to see if you are an appropriate candidate. So as Michael said, this is just a standard version, but we can tailor this for schools. There's less than 20 questions. Most are yes or no. Some are sort of multiple choice. And essentially it's split over 4 categories of questions: engagement and advocacy, role and responsibility, qualifications, and credibility. And I said all of these questions are completely bespoke. Now I'll just take you through a few things. I'm not going to show you the whole thing. So it's all personalized here. You can say, so we can put in the right contact. Again, this is completely tailored to you and your school if you want it. And then my last name, and I'll just put in my email address, because essentially what we do here, you can actually send them some information if they want to put their email address in. So we won't go into certain questions, but I'll just pull out a few questions. So for example, you want people potentially, and this, again, this is up to you to grade how important this is for you when you use this. You might want people who have shown a past interest in the school, or if they haven't, they really, really want to. We haven't added a 4th option here of just no, because I'm assuming that people who don't participate in school events and just say no, they don't want to, aren't going to be your ideal candidates. So it's not really a choice. Another question going down here to question 7 is, why do you want to be involved? And this is where you can have a good mix and you can choose as many as you want. We've put in here what we think are the 4 most important reasons, but everybody has their own reason, hence why there's sort of an other here. So again, I have the experience of doing this before, I have the passion and the time for it. You might believe that the school could do better, and therefore, so you're trying to drive a little bit of change, and that could be improvement in relationships or in planning. Just skipping down to another question in a different category. Here's another one, which I think is really important. A lot of people get into the boardroom really not knowing and understanding what the commitment is, what their roles and responsibilities are. And we have a question there about whether you know that or not. And even if they say no, you can prompt them with some reading or a workshop they have to come to before they join the board. But I think the time element is critical. And again, we put in the 10 to 20 hours here because that's a sort of standard figure for most boards. But it could be less, it could be more. So again, that's the great thing about having a tool which can be tailored to your school. If you believe it's a 30-hour per month commitment, or you want to do it on how many days of the week, you want to actually see, is this a filter? Because some candidates might go, you know, actually, I don't have the time. Or they go, wow, I didn't realize it was that little time. I do have the time, so I can go yes. And that could be some myths or expectations that are then being answered in that respect. And that's why this acts as such a good, easy filter. Just one more question I want to highlight near the end, and I think this is absolutely vital. You might be looking at certain skills, so you might be driven to remove some of these and say, well, we're only looking for these types of skills. However, as we talked about, you're building up a list and a bench or a pipeline of people that potentially could volunteer at a non-board level and get involved in the community in a different level and provide their skills elsewhere. So again, what you want to do is not exclude people and say, look, you know, just highlight who your skills are, and then you can filter them towards where you might be looking and what they could be doing later on. And I think that's a critical part of it. Look, there's more, and if you're interested, I'd reach out to Michael or join us at the conference that we'll be talking about. Off the back of this diagnostic tool comes a report that weights the respondents' answers and will help the board quickly screen a candidate's suitability. And Mike, we won't introduce the report right now, but if you can give us a bit more details about what's in that report.
I mean, simply what we want to do is respect time, because ideally, if this is out there consistently and people have the opportunity to do it year round, not just 3 months before an AGM, you can be collecting this information year round. And on top of that, you can be providing them an automated response. So the report is actually an opportunity to red light, yellow light, green light candidates. Green light is saying, hey, we think you'd be an excellent candidate for the board, and we want to get you more involved in the school. And that green light really sends a message to the chair or parent associations member to basically reach out directly and say, hey, we want to get more involved with you. Let us know what how much time you have, and here's a couple ideas. Yellow and red lights, though, are messages we want to send back to the candidate saying, hey, we're really excited that you want to contribute more to the school, but here's a few suggestions so that we can get to know you better and so that you can get to know the community better, as well as also if they're a red light candidate, that probably means that they need more information about the role, or perhaps their experience doesn't quite align with what is needed right now. So therefore, you have an opportunity to send back some automated feedback saying, hey, here's some information about the role, how we're structured. Please read up on it, and please come out to more events. And when you get the opportunity, reach out to one of the governors that you see. So largely, that's what the.
So I was just saying, it really is a fantastic engagement tool, and it's so simple to use, and yeah, in the experience of the other diagnostic tools that we've built at Future Directors, it works wonders.
Yeah, and I see we're here at the 8:30 mark. We've been able to address quite a few questions. There's 2 or 3 more queued up. What I'm going to be doing is I'll be responding to these individually. But please see this as the starting journey of effective governance. That next step you take is selection and orientation. And that's really what we're talking about September 22nd in Hong Kong. So if you have the opportunity, please join us. If you are further afoot and cannot for that day, rest assured, Paul and I are going to be leading additional webinars about various governance topics throughout this school year. And we look forward to your participation. Paul, any final words?
Look, it's just been fantastic. Again, apologize for people. We ran over time a little bit, but there's just so much depth to this topic. I think keeping within 30 minutes was actually fantastic. Yeah, some of the questions that are coming through, if you've got any questions for me, please pass them through Michael. Otherwise, it's been a pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you.
All right. Thank you again, everybody, and have a great day and a great weekend.